and welcome to another episode of PDA Dad UK. In this episode I'm going to be looking at echolalia. Now, echolalia is a very common autistic trait, but it's not limited to autism, and it's to do with speech development. So for neurotypical kids, they tend to learn words in a singular way or in short phrases. So they'll learn the meaning of bicky, for example, may mean biscuit. They'll use that, they'll repeat it, and they know that bicky refers to a biscuit. So they ask for a bicky and they then get a biscuit in return. For echolalia, it tends to use more complicated phrases. So it may be, it's time for bed. However, the individual words in there aren't understood or necessarily understood. So the term bed, they don't understand that it refers to the place they go and lie down and go to sleep. So they use the phrases, and it's often used as a stim. If you don't understand stimming, please do check out my video on stimming. It's very helpful for understanding that. It's basically a way of calming and regulating emotional overload. So stimming is something that particularly autistic kids will do, but a lot of people do. I do it myself, even though I'm neurotypical. And it's just a way of comforting yourself in a stressful situation or an overly emotional situation where the sensory overload has kicked in. So for me, I jiggle my feet, but it may be, shaking hands, whatever. Do check out the video, it explains it in much better detail. Echolalia can be used the same way. So a word or a phrase or even a sound that not necessarily is understood, but just repeated. There's something in the way it feels when it's said or the way it sounds that's appealing. And so they repeat it and it creates that comfort. However, with echolalia, it's often a case that, as I say, where neurotypical kids will learn speech through learning individual words and becoming used to those words and understanding the meaning, much more complicated phrases are used, but they're not understood as the phrase. It's simply an echoing without understanding. So for people who are using echolalia or who are experiencing echolalia, it's easy to tell once you know what you're looking for that it's echolalia that's being displayed. It will be a direct echoing of something that's said, and it might be something, it's a phrase on TV or a sound they've heard, part of a song. My daughter is notorious with this. She sings as one of her stims, and she will just repeat saying the same phrase from a song over and over again. You'll hear that one short burst. It's kind of like when you get the earworms and it's just playing over in your head. It's often just a snippet of a song that's just repeating, and that's what they do. It's this sort of echoing of a sound, a word, a phrase, or even part of a song that they've heard, and they repeat it, but they'll repeat it tonally correctly and in the same way every time. Even if they can't, it might not be easy to understand, but they will say it the same way every time. So it is echoing, and they'll keep the same intonation and the same phrasing behind it. They won't chop and change the words. It's the complete phrase or the complete A to Z of the sound that they've got that they will keep repeating, and it'll be the same every time. In a way, echolalia is a lot like masking, or it is often used for masking. Girls, for some reason, are very adept at this. My daughter certainly was when she was younger with her forms of masking. If you don't understand masking, please do check out my video. It's very helpful for understanding masking, and it's something that a lot of educators need to understand, that there's a reason why their kids are so good at school and then get home and it all explodes. They don't see the behaviours at school. But part of masking is often using echolalia. So they'll say things. So you can actually, it will seem like a child understands. Do you understand what I'm saying? No, you mustn't go to the cupboard. Okay, I mustn't go to the cupboard. Okay, I mustn't go to the cupboard. They'll repeat it, but they don't really understand the context, the content that they're phrasing back. And you can have some very convincing conversation within masking and think that you've really got through, but absolutely nothing of what you said has got through. There's simply cues that they're following, and they're using echolalia to echo back phrases that they've heard that work in a certain situation that can really become a big part of masking. But that's what echolalia is, constantly repeating these same phrases or words, and that in itself is part of their learning process. And as I say, all kids at some point use a form of echolalia. They echo words back. So toddlers will do this when they're learning to speak. The difference is they're learning the meaning of the word behind it. So there are two forms of echolalia when you dumb it down and actually bring it down to its bare basics. There's immediate echolalia and there's delayed echolalia. Immediate echolalia is that immediate echoing of something that's said to the child. So you might say thank you, and they'll memorize that and they'll keep saying it, and they'll thank you. And it can be a trigger for, a way that they learn to say thank you for something that's good. But they'll say it with the same intonation and the same phrasing, but it's often it's an immediate response. Say thank you. It's an immediate echolalia. They don't really understand what they're saying necessarily, but what they're doing is simply echoing back what they've heard. The second form is delayed echolalia. And delayed echolalia is when these things come in later on, and you can notice it often. It really does come into stimming again. Once a child is stimming and it's something they find comforting, if a child's going through a particularly stressful situation, you may hear them repeating certain phrases and certain words they've heard. It might seem right out of context of what they're doing, and that they are out of context of what they're doing, but what they're actually doing is finding it soothing and helping to self-regulate their emotional output and keep them calm in certain situations. And that can be delayed echolalia. It's not something that they've responded to immediately. It's a phrase or a pattern of words that they've learned, and they will then repeat later on, and they can repeat them over and over and over again sometimes, and they will use them at inopportune times. But that's where it really comes into that stimming side of where echolalia is presented. A really interesting way to spot echolalia in practice is often with phrases from films. My daughter is particularly adept at this. If she's watched a film, she'll know certain phrases in that film. She can actually recite chunks of a film that she's watched. She doesn't really have enough focal ability with the ADHD side of things to sit and watch an entire film. But for TV shows, and particularly YouTube clips that she watches where she can take them in piecemeal and they're shorter and she can process them better, she will often, if she's watching something for a second or third time, she'll often repeat back what's happening early on, because that's the echolalia coming forth, and it's part of that learning process and learning those social cues. So there's another two categories that echolalia fits into is functioning and non-functioning. We kind of touched on this already. A lot of echolalia will just simply be words or phrases they've used, and they can be really disarming because they seem like actually they know what they're talking about. This seems like a really cogent and thought through conversation I'm having with my child. In fact, they may not understand a single thing that's going on, and it can be just random sounds as well, but they'll be the same sounds over time. So it could be the sound of a car, it could be the sound of a boat, it could be the sound of a bird cheeping, cats meowing, or just random gurgling, burbling sounds, but they will have the same pattern to them all the time. That's echolalia, and it's non-functioning. It doesn't have a purpose. It simply, again, ties into that stimming thing. It's calming and it's comforting, and so they'll use it for that purpose. For functioning echolalia, it's the same thing. It's a repeated pattern or a repeated phrase they've heard, but it has a function. So a good example is, it may be something on an ad where the famous example would probably be the got milk ads that they had in the States. And that was a common phrase that everybody be, got milk. And if the kids learn that, they'll repeat it with the same intonation, the same phrasing that's on the ad, most likely. But it has a function. They actually are thirsty and they want to drink. Now, they may not be wanting specifically milk. They may just want some water or some squash or a fizzy drink, whatever. But the repeating of got milk is their way of having it has a function. It's a phrase they've learnt, they've repeated, they're echoing, but it has a function and a goal at the end of it. They want to have something to drink. So got milk can be a functioning form of echolalia. An interesting way you can sometimes see functioning echolalia is it has an answer, but it's not accurate. So you might ask your child, what did you have for lunch today? And they'll say, oh, I had pizza. They might have had fish and chips. But the answer, pizza, is the echolalia form of that response. It has a function, but it's not necessarily correct. They don't necessarily understand the contents of what's being said. They're not associating pizza with a triangular piece of bread with cheese and tomato on top of it. They may be saying it because it represents food to them. So the understanding isn't there, but they know it's a response to the question. So the question itself prompts that form of echolalia. It triggers it. They'll say pizza, and you'll find out later they had fish and chips. And why did you tell me you had fish and chips? And they'll kind of be lost in the answer. They won't really have a response to it. They won't have that processing to be able to say that. But that's what's gone on. The echolalia is a triggered functional form of echolalia that is being responded to from a question that has posed, and they know the answer fits with the question. Another way this can be seen is actually when frustrated. My daughter did this early on when learning phrases from TV. She watched an episode of, say, Peppa Pig, and it was, "Oh, don't be silly, George," or "George always says that." If she was frustrated, that might be her response to something. And she hasn't understood that, "Oh, George always says that." When, the dinosaur thing, if you've ever watched Peppa Pig, "Oh, George always says dinosaur." That's her response. That was her response to a lot of situations. And it was actually that she'd learned it was an expression of frustration. But again, the words didn't have a necessary meaning to her. The phrase as a whole was a response, and that's the echolalic response. And that functional echolalia is actually a really good thing, because it is the start of that process of learning responses to questions, and it is the beginning of that, starting to learn that there are responses and appropriate responses. And with time, they will usually learn to develop those so that they fit more effectively, and they do start to understand the meaning of the words behind it. It's basically so many things with autism and with neurodiversity. It's not necessarily, I've heard it said, it's not a disability, it's a different ability. And for kids who are autistic, often they won't learn speech patterns in the same way. They learn it through echolalia. So by repeating these different patterns, they are learning their speech and language as a result. So it can be a real positive. If your child is using functioning echolalia, it means that they're on their way to getting that understanding and that being able to place language in the right way. And it's often the start of communication. And for kids who are non-verbal or pre-verbal, it's often a really useful thing. They are able to, it's often the beginning of that speech starting. And it's why sometimes for a lot of kids, with parents who've got kids with speech delay or a pre-verbal or non-verbal, and they suddenly start using these big phrases like, "Where did it come from?" That's what echolalia is. They don't necessarily understand the words that are contained, but they are then spouting it out. And if it's functioning, it means that they're now assigning a meaning to what they're saying. It may not be the correct meaning, or it may be only a related meaning. It may not be the exact right meaning, but it's the beginning, and it's something that a lot of speech and language therapists and all that kind of that area or group of people basically start with when they're dealing with autistic kids in particular who have speech delay or are in those pre or non-verbal states. So a question that often comes up is, what do you do about echolalia? Is it a problem? Is it something that you need to be addressing? That's definitely not the case. Echolalia is a really healthy thing, and it shouldn't be suppressed. It comes back to the stimming thing. Never suppress stimming unless it's self-injurious, and echolalia is a form of stimming, when it's a stimming form of echolalia, is a form of stimming that is completely non-harmful, and they're actually learning from it. And you may be, if you try and suppress it, not only are you probably suppressing that calming side of things where they're using it to regulate their emotional overload, what you can also be doing is inhibiting their speech development. So echolalia, it can be awkward and it can be funny to sort of witness sometimes, as many forms of stimming can be. However, with echolalia, don't repress it, encourage it, because it's where those neurological pathways are going to be built between speech, language and understanding. So it's a really good thing. And as I say, a lot of speech therapists and language therapists will use echolalia as a starting point. And it's why it's so often surprising for people who've got non-verbal or pre-verbal kids who then suddenly start using these big long sentences. It's because it's been something that's going on internally for quite some time. And as I say, they don't necessarily understand all the words, but the phrase may well have a purpose if it's functioning echolalia. And non-functioning echolalia will often develop into a functioning form of echolalia. So don't repress it, keep it going, encourage it if you can, and it's something that can be really useful. If you're experiencing problems with speech delay or language delay, if they're pre-verbal, if they're non-verbal, if that's an experience that you guys are having with your kids, do engage SALT services, speech and language therapy. They are really helpful, and they have a lot of really good ways to develop these things. So rather than just being something you necessarily do on your own, by engaging speech and language therapy, they will actually encourage these things, and they've got structures and formats they can use to encourage you at home to use it, to learn techniques to bring it out, and also to reinforce it with your kids so that they're actually learning and developing in their language and speech development. It's a really healthy thing. Please do like this, please do subscribe. The more people who subscribe, the more people who get to hear this information, and it can be really useful for so many people. So please do click on that like, click on the bell, you'll get notified when new posts go up. In the meantime, stay safe, and I will see you again next time.